The Marvel Cinematic Universe is arguably one of the most ambitious and revolutionary film franchises of all time. Sure, it wasn't unheard of for popular films to get an occasional crossover, but it wasn't until the MCU that we would get a long-running film series featuring multiple groups of characters that were intended to coexist from the very beginning. At least, not on the same scale. And 2012 was when we got our first taste of this franchise's true potential with The Avengers. At the time, it was arguably the biggest superhero movie ever made. A movie with 6 main characters, all with their own backstories and personalities, not to mention multiple supporting characters and plot elements, and combining several different genres such as fantasy, science fiction, action, and spy thriller, but with 5 previous movies worth of setup to keep it from feeling overwhelming, stretched thin, or thematically disjointed. And since then, the MCU has only gotten bigger, introducing new characters, expanding the world building, and upping the stakes and the scale even further. That does raise a question though. The Avengers may have set the example 10 years ago for what a cinematic universe could accomplish, but now that we're a lot more used to seeing these characters come together and on a much larger scale, and we've seen other franchises create their own variations on the formula, how well does the original Avengers still hold up? To start off, this movie wastes no time conveying to the audience that the Avengers assembling is something that needs to happen. They aren't just going up against a threat like what we've seen before from the MCU, the kind that a single hero could feasibly handle on their own, and they aren't just teaming up just as a gimmick. The film begins in a top-secret S.H.I.E.L.D. facility, where the Tesseract, an artifact with immense power, is being studied, and it's behaving strangely, prompting an evacuation and high-ranking agent Nick Fury being called in. Already we can tell that the stakes are high. We've seen the death and destruction that the Tesseract is capable of, so to see it behaving so unpredictably that S.H.I.E.L.D. are choosing to evacuate gives the scene a sense of dread. The Tesseract ultimately opens a portal for Loki to come through and steal it, declaring his intention to become ruler of the planet after being denied the throne of Asgard. Right off the bat, we establish the threat that Loki presents, as he's not only willing but eager to destroy an entire facility full of people to get the Tesseract, and take a number of people, including Hawkeye, a highly trained S.H.I.E.L.D. agent and Avenger, as mind-controlled slaves. Loki escapes with both the Tesseract and his brainwashed victims, leaving S.H.I.E.L.D. in desperate need of something to even the odds. The scene ends with Agent Coulson asking Fury,
"What do we do?"
And Fury gives a look, knowing as well as we do just who to call, as the music builds and crescendos with the Avengers theme playing, and a title card to answer Coulson's question. Admittedly, the theme being placed there packs an extra punch now that we've had so many years of hearing it as a triumphant piece of fanfare, so hearing it as we know they're about to be assembled for the first time really gets you hyped for what's to come. The scene also sets the mood for what to expect from Loki going forward. Throughout the movie, he's portrayed as being extremely arrogant and seeing others as beneath him. It's clear he's let his god status go to his head. It's also reflected in how he describes his plan of conquering the world as freeing people from lives of scrambling for power and instead forcing them into subservience, believing the guidance and lack of struggle will make them happier. He also sees taking the power and supposedly the struggle for himself as an act of benevolence and selflessness, another way of him trying to emphasize his godliness. You can tell, though, that for all the time he spends wording his plan as an act of kindness, he's really just in it to be worshipped. All the talk of generosity is really just to fuel his own ego even further, whether he realizes it or not. As Loki himself puts it,
"I am burdened with glorious purpose."
And these character traits get reinforced all throughout the movie, as we constantly see him building himself up as a figure to be worshipped and trying to make others feel small in comparison, either by verbal intimidation or physical violence against those who defy him. It also acts as arguably his biggest weakness, as his arrogance can often get the better of him, doing things like getting so caught up in gloating he doesn't even realize he's giving away crucial parts of his plan, or trying so hard to assert his dominance in a conversation that he lets his guard down. Another thing I really like is that the movie actually spends a pretty decent amount of time setting up each of the characters individually, spending a few minutes with each member of the Avengers and showing what their current status quos are as Coulson, Black Widow, and Fury come to recruit them. Early on, for example, we get to see what the Hulk has been getting up to, which seems to include very little hulking and very little smashing. Instead, he's been living in India helping the sick. It's interesting to see how he's been trying to make the best out of a bad situation by aiding people who sorely need it, despite the fact that the Hulk has forced him to give up on the life that he was hoping to have. It's made especially sad when he mentions,
Oh, I don't every time get what I want.
while rocking a nearby crib, implying that all he really wants to do is live a normal life and raise a family. The film then gives us Captain America's introduction. In his first film appearance since waking up after being unconscious for 70 years, we see him beating a punching bag in an otherwise empty gym, emphasizing how alone he is now that everyone he knows is gone. At least as far as he's aware. And he's keeping in shape and practicing his fighting ability because that disciplined soldier mindset is the only thing from his past he has left. As he's punching, he flashes back to his final moments of consciousness in the 20th century, bidding farewell to Peggy Carter, the love of his life, as his punches get more and more intense, until eventually the punching bag's chain breaks and the bag flies across the room. He's still the powerful super soldier, but with no war left to fight and a world with seemingly no place for him. A life that he reluctantly accepts as he picks up another punching bag and repeats the process. So, yeah, you can understand that he'd be eager to take up Fury's offer to go out and save the world again, especially from a villain planning to use the same Tesseract that he's seen Hydra use for their own nefarious plot. We then get Iron Man's introductory scene, and I love the subtle storytelling that Fury mentions Howard Stark using the Tesseract, which he found in the ocean to try and find a source of sustainable energy, and then cutting to Tony in the ocean testing an invention as a source of sustainable energy, following in his father's footsteps by using his resources and intellect to make the world a better place. Thor doesn't show up until later in the movie, but his first scene confronting Loki is a really strong moment of character interaction. In the scene, Thor is confronting Loki about the Tesseract, and we get a great demonstration of the mixed feelings Thor has about the situation. The concern and anger he has for Loki's invasion of Earth.
Where is the Tesseract?
I missed you too.
Do I look to be in a gaming mood?
But also the love and heartbreak he has for his brother by expressing the grief that he felt when Loki made him think he was dead.
Did you mourn? We all did.
And the frustration of trying to make him see that he's misguided and should abandon his plan and return to Asgard because he wants Loki to be better.
You give up the Tesseract! You give up this poisonous dream! You come home.
Now, going back to this movie 10 years later, you realize that it is quite reliant on the novelty of seeing these characters come together, while the plot and thematic depth are honestly pretty minimal, especially compared to later films like Infinity War and Endgame. For the most part, this isn't too much of an issue, as the characters themselves actually have quite a hefty amount of personality that just listening to them talk to each other is really engaging and entertaining. In that regard, you can make the argument that one of the movie's biggest strengths is also one of the most important aspects of making a crossover, exploring how these characters interact. I think some of the best examples of this is seeing Tony interact with Banner and Cap. Throughout the MCU, Tony is almost always the smartest one in the room, and he knows it. As a result, he typically approaches every situation with a casual, even kind of arrogant attitude. The way he interacts with Banner shows a number of different layers to him. Because of how much Banner is forced to restrain himself emotionally, he's a little more serious than Tony and a lot more pessimistic. Tony, while he may not be particularly sensitive towards Banner's condition, still clearly respects his intelligence and sees him as someone he can relate to. Also, his lack of sensitivity doesn't come from a place of malice, as he's genuinely fascinated by the Hulk and the force for good it has the potential to be, as he would be, being a man who explores scientific possibilities for the good of the world. And this gives Banner a friend, which is something he'd long since given up on. Tony's more rocky relationship with Cap is also really engaging to watch. While Tony doesn't take the situation all that seriously, as he's intelligent enough to solve almost any problem, Cap is much more cautious due to his orderly soldier training, and he sees Tony as irresponsible and obnoxious. Plus, there's also the contrast of Tony, a man who became a hero through his own ingenuity but is somewhat unruly with his methods, and Cap, a man who had his powers essentially gifted to him but is much more self-controlled with how he uses them. Granted, some other characters don't get quite as much depth, but they're still entertaining in their own right. Even if I can sort of see why characters like Thor, Widow, and Hawkeye weren't commonly regarded as many people's favorite Avengers until getting some more development a few movies later. Now, as good as all of this is, it's unfortunately not without its fair share of shortcomings. As I said, a lot of the film relies on the novelty of seeing these characters teaming up, while the plot takes somewhat of a back seat. And while a lot of what's present in this movie was pretty unprecedented when the film was first released, that novelty isn't quite as strong as it once was, due to the fact that seeing these characters together is actually fairly common nowadays, often in stories that have much more depth and dramatic tension. Don't get me wrong, this movie still has those elements, but not to the same extent, which becomes especially evident roughly around the midpoint of the movie. At this point, Loki's been successfully apprehended, and the Avengers are working on locating the Tesseract. While they're doing that, Loki is awaiting rescue from a mind-controlled Hawkeye, and the plot kinda starts to drag in my opinion. It doesn't become outright boring, but I do think certain things could have been handled better. One way the movie tries to build intrigue is a reveal that S.H.I.E.L.D. is planning to use the Tesseract to develop weapons of mass destruction, which naturally makes the Avengers a tad skeptical about helping them locate it. Fury explains that the plan for weapons is to defend the Earth against potential threats from other worlds, and this results in a brief argument between the characters, but it ultimately doesn't really amount to much, and I can't help but think it could have been cut. Also, while I have spent a good chunk of this video thus far praising the characters' personal conflicts and their relationships to one another, I can't help but feel like those scenes are mainly effective in the moment and don't really do much to drive the events of the actual plot. This really starts to show during Hawkeye's attack on the helicarrier, leading to Loki's escape. The scene is meant to show the Avengers failing to work together to the point of nearly getting killed, making them question whether they're really able to work together as a team. In practice though, the scene doesn't really pay off the fact that they've been struggling to work together or cause them to go on character arcs to overcome their personal issues and learn to work better. For example, throughout the attack, Iron Man is busy fixing the helicarrier's damaged engine while Cap defends him from the attackers. You'd think that since the movie has spent so much time emphasizing that they don't get along, to the point of challenging each other to a fight, that it would lead them to struggling to work together and inadvertently put the mission in jeopardy, but in practice they arguably have the biggest victory in their side of the battle. At no point while fixing the engine do their personalities or strategies clash, causing them to make mistakes or hinder each other. Instead, they prevent the helicarrier from falling, saving the lives of half the Avengers and a large number of S.H.I.E.L.D. personnel. They honestly seem to work pretty well together, all things considered. And the other characters don't really have that much beef with each other, so working as a team doesn't really come up as an issue, especially considering during this scene most of them are all fighting on their own. The only other character that factors into the theme of teamwork in this scene is the Hulk, seeing as how he ends up losing control and becomes one of the biggest threats towards the safety of the helicarrier and his own teammates. This could have potentially been a great source for drama for Banner going forward. Maybe during the battle's aftermath he could reflect on the damage he caused and refuse to work with the Avengers, deciding that he's too dangerous to be part of a team. Then he could go through an arc where he learns that he's needed and that his condition could actually do some good, and maybe even gain some semblance of control over the Hulk through working alongside the Avengers. Maybe build on the scenes with Tony from before and have him give Banner some encouragement. Also, during the attack, Thor decides to go after Loki on his own, leading to him getting outsmarted, leading to Coulson coming to save him, leading to Coulson getting killed. Or not, I don't know. I haven't seen Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., but apparently he's alive in that, I guess. Anyway, this could have potentially been a good way to show him failing to work as part of a team because he's too focused on his personal conflict with Loki and rushes to stop him without waiting for backup. He could have then perhaps had an arc about learning to work cooperatively and not letting his impulses and personal needs get the better of him. Finally, Black Widow's also fighting solo against Hawkeye to try and snap him out of Loki's spell, and conceptually, this scene actually works quite well. Widow's fighting to rescue the free will of her longtime teammate and friend. My problem is that the movie hasn't really done much to create a bond between these two to make me root for things to turn out okay. To its credit, there is evidence that Widow cares for Hawkeye, considering she abandons a potentially valuable interrogation without question after hearing that he's in trouble early in the film. And she gives a brief monologue to Loki where she talks vaguely about her history with him, but the movie doesn't really explore what their friendship is like or what important parts of their lives they are for each other. It also doesn't help that at that point in the MCU's timeline, Hawkeye hadn't had a ton of characterization, so I'm not terribly concerned for his well-being. I think this could have been improved if we maybe saw a flashback of them working together and bonding. Maybe let us see the story that Widow tells Loki about him instead of just ambiguous details. Give me something that I can get emotionally connected to. Now, I know this review may have suddenly come off as quite negative, but don't worry, I do still have plenty of good to talk about. I just feel that this movie is relying a little too much on something that is still a lot of fun, but not as impressive as it was back in 2012, making it seem a little style over substance and arguably even slightly dated, considering other movies have since done what this movie has done and built upon the concept. I'll get back to talking positively now though, starting with the action. Yeah, I know, I just spent the last section of the review complaining about an action scene, but even if the movie's plot has its shortcomings, the action itself is still a hell of a lot of fun. For example, during Black Widow's introduction in the movie, we see her escaping a hostage situation by taking on 3 guys while tied to a chair. It's a great way of re-establishing her fighting style after Iron Man 2, as the choreography is very fast-paced and acrobatic. It also shows off how capable of a fighter she is, that she's able to take on multiple people while restrained to a heavy object, to the point where she's able to both use it to her advantage and even escape it mid-fight. We later get to see a fight between Iron Man and Thor in the forest, with a brief intervention with Captain America towards the end of the scene. This fight is fairly decent. It makes some creative use of how these characters would interact with each other, like Thor being able to crush Iron Man's armor, Iron Man being able to use Thor's lightning against him by using it to charge his suit, Thor's hammer hitting Cap's vibranium shield causing a massive shockwave, the type of fan-servicey things you expect from a crossover like this. Admittedly, some of the blows could have been made to feel a little bit more powerful, maybe by causing a little more destruction to the area around them, but aside from that, it's not a bad fight. As for the helicarrier battle, yeah sure, I may have my criticisms with it from a story perspective, but I won't deny that it is very entertaining and makes good use of each of the characters' abilities. We get to see Thor and an out-of-control Hulk, for example, arguably the 2 most physically strong members of the team, go against each other, and it leads to a fight where every blow feels suitably weighty and powerful. From Thor barely managing to lift Hulk's arm as he presses down on him, to Thor clanging Hulk in the face with Mjolnir, stopping a running Hulk right in his tracks, to Hulk trying to lift Mjolnir with so much strength his feet force craters into the ground. The Hulk throughout the helicarrier attack in general is extremely ferocious, with so much destruction and debris flying everywhere as he rampages through it. Some people might be disappointed at the fact that Iron Man takes a backseat for most of the combat in this scene, but I personally like how the task of repairing the engine goes to the most tech-savvy member of the team. It shows how he's got more skills to offer than just having a suit of armor. Cap gets a good fight against a bunch of soldiers in the meantime, allowing him to exercise his training from the war, with some hand-to-hand fighting and gunplay. All of that mixed in with challenging his super soldier abilities by having him jump around a destroyed area of the ship where he's constantly at risk of falling and very nearly does once or twice. Finally, we get the one-on-one fight between Black Widow and Hawkeye. While the Thor vs. Hulk fight was made to be slightly slower with more powerful impacts, this fight opts for more realistic punching and kicking at a more rapid speed, which helps to vary the pacing of the helicarrier battle as a whole. The 2 also perform some acrobatics to catch each other off guard and use a few weapons such as knives to add some tension. With all that said, however, with all the comments that I've made about this movie so far, both positive and negative, it's the climax of this film that really gives it its darling reputation. The Chitauri invasion of New York, the biggest and most ambitious battle the MCU had attempted at this point in its then 6-movie run, and even nowadays it still stands as one of the most impressive and large-scale action scenes in the entire franchise, and in film in general. I think the main reason this battle works is that it feels incredibly varied and uses each of the characters' abilities to their fullest potential. Cap, Widow, and to some extent Thor, for example, focus mainly on hand-to-hand combat with some weapons thrown in. Despite the battle's premise of superheroes teaming up to stop a Norse god-led alien invasion, the added realism that these characters' fighting styles bring really helps to keep the action somewhat grounded and visceral. Not to mention it adds an aggressive feel to the fight. They do still play into the fantasy element of the battle though, with Thor getting some pretty explosive attacks in with his lightning powers, taking out a good few of the Chitauri army's biggest forces like they're nothing. Not to mention Widow making good use of some Chitauri weaponry and vehicles, and Cap making leaps and taking beatings that no ordinary human could withstand without the super soldier serum. Hawkeye, by comparison, leans slightly more into the fantasy angle during the battle, as while he does also incorporate some hand-to-hand combat, he's more focused on fighting from the rooftops, making use of some creative trick arrows such as explosive arrows, melting arrows, and grappling hook arrows, giving his skill set more of a Swiss Army knife approach. Iron Man leans even heavier into the fantasy of the battle as he spends most of the fight flying around and shooting lasers, keeping the action fast-paced. The Hulk is probably the character that leans most into the fantasy elements of the battle, as he spends the majority of it jumping from skyscraper to skyscraper, wrecking any building he touches and smashing his way through entire groups of Chitauri in seconds, and going full Shadow of the Colossus on a couple of Leviathans. The Leviathans especially are fun to watch Hulk fight, because while it is impressive seeing Hulk being able to take them down, the movie emphasizes that the Hulk really has to put effort into fighting them. It's further demonstrated by the fact that the Leviathans pose a huge physical threat to the Hulk, and the fact that the largest Avenger is tiny, dare I say puny, compared to them. The climax is also helped by the fact that there's a good variety of Chitauri types, so each member of the team has their own type that they're most evenly matched against. Cap and Widow mainly fight the ground troops, Hawkeye and Iron Man mainly deal with the hovercraft riders, and Hulk and Thor take out the Leviathans. That being said, there is also some overlap in terms of who fights what, to help keep the battle somewhat unpredictable. It also helps to create a good reason for why these characters are teaming up in the first place, as they each have their own strengths, but also their own weaknesses that the other members can help with. Now, to be fair, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a few flaws present in the climax, but they are minor ones. For one, despite being the main villain of the story, Loki is surprisingly not very involved in the final battle. I realize that he is meant to be more of a schemer than a fighter to contrast with the Avengers, but it would have been interesting to see him do more, like maybe show him commanding the Chitauri from the sidelines, or using his powers of deception and illusion to confuse or disorient the Avengers. We've seen him do this kind of thing elsewhere, so imagine seeing it being done in the middle of an intense war zone where the Avengers don't have time to process what is and isn't real. Instead, all we get is an honestly pretty forgettable fistfight with Thor, an equally forgettable ride in a hovercraft, and one genuinely quite funny scene where he once again lets his ego get the better of him as he tries to talk the Hulk of all characters into submission.
And I will not be bullied by that.
It is also kind of a shame that since the movie's midpoint didn't do much to mine the potential of the characters' conflicts, there isn't a ton for the climax to resolve, outside of just defeating Loki. There is one moment towards the end where Iron Man risks his life by flying a nuke into the sky portal to take out the Chitauri and save the city, tying back into Cap's earlier comment.
You're not the guy to make the sacrifice play, to lay down on a wire and let the other guy crawl over you.
But it's a resolution to something that was only mentioned very briefly in one previous scene. Still, even if the climax doesn't have the greatest dramatic depth, it still passes with flying colors due to how fun it is and the sheer scale that is still very impressive to this day. And at the end of the day, that's a good metaphor for the movie as a whole. It's not particularly deep or thought-provoking, but the charm, personality, entertainment, and spectacle that it offers comes in spades. Ideally, I'd like a more complex story and character arcs to go along with it, but what we do have is just so engaging and exciting with a group of likable characters that you only want to see more of. Going back to my question from the beginning of this video, I can confidently say that this movie, for the most part, does still hold up 10 years later, and is arguably one of the MCU's best outings, and definitely one of its most important for the foundation it set. It may be a victim of films that have come out since and built on the concept, but I have no problem recommending it all these years and all these movies later. And so that was my review of the Avengers. I really hope you enjoyed it, and if you did, be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell because more videos are coming. I'm gonna do my best to try and upload at least somewhat regularly, so stick around. Also, let me know what you thought about this video in the comments below because I genuinely do appreciate the feedback. And yes, I am fine with criticism. It's the only way I'll learn. And yes, I am planning on getting a better camera than this, don't worry. But until I do, you're probably not going to be seeing my face all that often, so hopefully you're content with just my voice for the time being. Anyway, hope you enjoyed everything. I will leave you now. Goodbye.